victorious. Yep. To balance your left foot and Wi-Fi. Funny. All right, here we go. Page 33, part 2. Marxism and African Liberation, chapter 3. First of all, we must understand the background of this kind of debate. When one is asked to speak on the relevance of Marxism to Africa at this particular time, one is being asked to involve oneself in historical debates. An ongoing debate in this country, particularly among the black population. It is a debate which has heightened over the last year. And from my own observation, it is being waged in a large number of places across this country. Sometimes it appears in the guise of the so-called nationalist versus the Marxists. Sometimes it appears that in the guise of those who claim to espouse the class position, as opposed to those who claim and espouse a race position. Thus, it would not be possible for us in a single session to enter into all ramifications of that debate. But it does form a background for our discussion. It is important. It is an important debate. It is an important fact that such issues are being debated in this country today, just as they're being debated in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and in many parts of the metropolitan world, in Western Europe, and in Japan. Because the widespread nature of the debate and its intensity at this time is reflection of the crisis in the capitalist imperialist mode. Widespread nature of the debate and its intensity at this time is reflection of the crisis in the capitalist imperialist mode of production. Ideas and discussions do not just drop from the sky. There is not simply a plot on the part of certain individuals to engage others in the meaningless debate. Whatever the outcome of the debate, whatever the posture of indifferent participants adopt, the very fact of the debate is representative of the crisis of capitalism and imperialism. Today, and as the crisis deepens, people find it more and more difficult to accept the old modes of thought that rationalize the system which is collapsing. Hence the need to search for new directions. And quite clearly, Marxism, scientific socialism, poses itself as one of the most obvious of the available options. The question is not new to Africa or to black people as a whole. It is perhaps essential to understand. Many of us have raised before the question of the relevance of Marxism to this or that. Its relevance to Europe. Many European intellectuals debated its relevance to their own societies. Its relevance to Asia was debated in Asia, debated by Asians. The relevance of Latin America was debated by Latin Americans. Individuals who have long debated the relevance of Marxism to their own time. Was it relevant to the 19th century? If so, to their own time. Was it relevant to the 19th century? If so, was it still relevant to the 20th century? One can debate its relevance to a given facet. Was it still relevant to the 20th century? One can debate its relevance to a given facet of the culture of society or to the society's law or culture as a whole. These are all issues that to a given facet of the culture of society or to the society's law or culture as a whole. These are all issues that have been debated before, and we should have some sense of history when we approach this question today. Because with that sense of history, we can ask, why is it that the question of the relevance of Marxism to society always crops up? And in a very brief answer, I would suggest that what is common to the application of the question is, first of all, a condition of struggle, a condition in which people are dissatisfied with the dominant mode of perceiving reality. At that point, they ask about the relevance of Marxism. More than that, the second condition is that people ask the question because of their own bourgeois framework. One starts out located within the dominant mode of reasoning, which is the mode of reasoning that supports capitalism and which we will call a bourgeois framework of perception. And because one starts out that way, it becomes necessary to raise the question about the relevance of Marxism. Also, one is advanced, and it's probably more accurate to raise the question of the relevance of bourgeoisie thought because the shoe would be on the other foot. But initially, it is true that, however much the bourgeoisie degree, there is one common uniting strand of all bourgeoisie thought. They make common cause in questioning the relevance of the logic and so on of Marxist thought. And therefore, in a sense, when we ask what questions, we are unfortunately also fitting into the framework and pattern. We are also in some way still embedded to the greater or lesser extent in the framework of bourgeoisie thought. And from that framework, we ask, with a great degree and hesitancy and uncertainty, framework of bourgeoisie thought. And from that framework, we ask, with a great degree and hesitancy and uncertainty, what is the relevance of Marxism? It is particularly true in our part of the world, that is, the English-speaking part of the world, because the Anglo-American tradition is one of intense hostility, philosophically speaking, towards Marxism, a hostility that manifests itself in a peculiar way. It manifests itself by trying to dislocate itself even from the study of Marxism. If you were to check on a continental tradition in Europe, you would find it is not the same. French, German, and Belgian intellectuals, whatever their perspective, understand the importance of Marxism. They study it, they relate to it, they understand the body of thought that is called Marxism, and they take a position vis-a-vis that body. They understand the body of thought that is called Marxism, and they take a position vis-a-vis that body of thought. In the English tradition, which was also handed down to this part of the world, to the Caribbean, to many thought. In the English tradition, which was also handed down to this part of the world, to the Caribbean, to many parts of Africa, it is fashionable and disavow any knowledge of Marxism. It is fashionable any parts of Africa, it is fashionable and disavow any knowledge of Marxism. It is fashionable to glory in one's ignorance, to say that we are against Marxism. When pressed about it, one responds, but why bother to read it? It is obviously absurd. So one knows it is absurd without reading it, and one doesn't read it because one knows it's absurd, and therefore one glories in one's ignorance and the position. So they're saying you need to read it. You got to read. You gotta somehow engage in it. Sometimes ask questions to see if Marxism can be utilized in the material conditions that we're in, and if it can be stretched and answer questions to advance it. Like, you gotta read it. You gotta figure out its basicness of what Marxism is, and then build off from that. It is rather difficult to seriously address the question of the relevance of Marxism unless one does a basic minimum of accepting that one should attempt to enter into this full body of thought, because it is a tremendous body of literature and analysis, and from the outside it is extremely difficult. Indeed, I would say that it is pointless, and from the outside it it is extremely difficult. Indeed, I would say that it is pointless strictly from the outside, without ever having moved towards trying to grapple with it. Is to ask, what is its relevance? It is almost a unanswerable question. I think in all honesty that for those of us who came from a certain background, and we all come from that background, one of the first things we have to do is establish the basis of familiarity with the different intellectual traditions. As we become familiar with them, we can then be in a better position to evaluate Marxism relevance or irrelevance in the case might be. So again, they're asking to go into debate, to learn about these things, and to have discussions of its relevancy. That's an important thing. So it's not like they're rejecting it. It's like they're asking for people to enter into that school of thought to have discussions of its relevancy. That's an important thing. So it's not like they're rejecting it. It's like they're asking for people to enter into that school of thought to have the debate of its relevancy. That's an important thing. So it's not like they're rejecting it. It's like they're asking for people to enter into that school of thought to have the debate of its relevancy. You know, discussion is whether the variance of time and place are relevant. Or, let me put it another way, whether the variance of time and place make a difference to whether Marxism is relevant or not. In a sense, we would almost have to assume the validity for the place in which it originated, Western Europe. We don't have the time to deal with that in detail, but we can ask, but we can then ask, assuming that Marxism was a relevance as a meaning, as a applicability to Western Europe, or had in the 19th century, to what extent does the validity extend geographically? To what extent does its validity extend across time? So they're asking the question, is Marxism a philosophy, a science that it can stand the test of time and place? Can it be applied in many different conditions? So that's the question. These are things that are valid reasons to go in and ask these questions about it, instead of just saying, oh, I don't like it, based on what you maybe heard from other people. These are the two variables of time and place. They can be translated to mean historical circumstances, time and culture, place, and what social and cultural conditions exist in each particular place. For us, to make it more precise, Black people, no doubt, well-meaning Black people, ask the question, rather an ideology which has historically generated within the culture of Western Europe in the 19th century is today in the third quarter of the 20th century still valid for another part of the world, namely Africa or the Caribbean or Black people in this country. Whether it is valid to other societies at other times. And this is the kind of formulation which I wish to present for the discussion. These are valid questions. Like, these are things that we should be doing as Marxists. Oh my God, it's so rage bait. Reading a book is such rage bait. Such rage bait. All right, methodology, the methodology of Marxism. I would suggest two basic reasons why I believe that Marxist thought, scientific socialist thought, would exist at different levels, at different times, in different places, and retain its potential as a tool, as a set of conceptions that people should grasp. The first is to look at Marxism as a methodology, because a methodology would virtually be, by definition, be independent of time and space. You will use the methodology that at any given time, at any given place, You may get different results, of course, but the methodology itself would be independent of time and space. And I agree that Marxism is that different time and space to different conditions. And essentially, see, this is why this book turned me into a Marxist. This is how I started my journey on Marxist thought. And essentially to engage in rather a truncated representation of Marxism. Inevitably oversimplifying, but nevertheless necessary in the context of limited time. I would suggest that one of the real bases of Marxist thought is that it starts from the perceptive of man's relationship to the material world, and that Marxism then it arose historically, consciously disassociated itself from the pitted and pitted itself against all other modes of perception, which started with ideas, with concepts, and with words, and rooted itself in the material conditions and in the social relations in society. This is the difference. This is the difference with which I will start a methodology that begins its analysis of any society, of any situation, by seeking the relations that arise from production between men. There are a whole variety of things which flow from that. Man's consciousness is formed in the intervention of nature. Nature itself is humanized through its interaction with man's. Just like the indigenous, with reciprocity. Man's labor produces a constant stream of technology that in turn creates other social changes. Love this. Walter Rodney, you're amazing. Sorry, no more great men. So this is the crux of the scientific socialist perception, a methodology that addresses itself to man's relationship in the process of production, on the assumption, which I think is a valid assumption, that production is not merely the basis of man's existence, but the basis for defining man as a special kind of being with a certain consciousness. It is only through production that the human race differentiates itself from the rest of the primates and the rest of life. What does Marxism pose itself against? It poses itself against the number of hypotheses, a number of views of the world, which starts with words and concepts for those who are familiar with Marx's own evolution. It is well known that he started by looking first at Hegel. So Hegel developed dialectics, but Marx and Engels took the idealistic part, the Christianity part, out of it and turned it on his head, and it became dialectical materialism, because it's dialectics based on the material world and how we engage with the material world and how materials engage with us and how the materials engage with each other. Hegel, a very plausible and perceptive analyst of the 19th century, who was guilty in Marx's own estimation of putting forward an entirely idealist position on that placed ideas in the center of the universe and saw the material, quote-unquote, world is virtually deriving from those ideas. I think about this. I felt that I wouldn't go into Hegel. I would go further than Hegel for a classic composition of the idealist worldview. I take it from the New Testament, the book of John, where he stated, quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That is the classic composition of an idealist position. You take every other thing from there. The world was God. The Word was God. But we are suggesting that the Word is itself, and oh my gosh, I'm gonna make sure I got this word right before I say it. Hold on a second, everybody. I always get stumped on the words. Nope. We go here. We go here. Sorry, everybody. We go. Come on. Give me the thing. Yeah, there we go. EMANATION. This tablet's taking forever to do shit. Emanation, an abstract but perceptible thing that issues or originates from the source. The action of process of issuing from the source. The tenuous substance of form and radiation given by something. So again, we are suggesting that the world is itself an emanation for people's activity as they attempt to communicate with each other, as they develop social relations out of production, and that we shouldn't be mystified with words. Naturally enough, we will have to deal with concepts and with the force of consciousness, which is a very powerful force, and one that even some Marxists have been tempted to underestimate. Now, Marx, taken that broad framework of methodology, tried to apply it to Western Europe. He applied it to a range of societies in different places at different times, but he concentrated his attention on Western Europe, as if examining the body of literature produced by Marx and Engels, you will find that they speak about slavery, about communal societies, about feudalism, but by and large they concentrate on capitalism. They hardly even talk about socialism. Marx's great contribution was his fantastic critique of the existing society, capitalist society. How did it come into being in the particular part of the world? The vast majority of their literature concerns this question. But as I said, when I referred to pre-capitalist society, especially feudalism, they talk about some other parts of the world. Occasionally, Marx mentions the Asiatic mode of production. Occasionally, he came across to look at the data concerning the United States. So he had something of a geographical span and lifelong span. It was also minimal, however, in comparison with the bulk of his work. That it is true that a lot of people haven't taken Marx's method and his conclusions and have seen them as one and the same thing. That Marxism is not merely a certain methodology applied to Western Europe, but is itself an ideology about Western Europe, about capitalism in the 19th century, and cannot transcend those boundaries, when clearly Marx was doing the job he had to do. He was looking at his own society. He was doing it under some of the most adverse conditions. He was doing it by mastering bourgeoisie knowledge and putting it to the service of changing and revolution. I suggest that the method was independent of time and place. It is implicit in Marx, and it becomes implicit in post-Marxian thought development. Using Marxian in the literal sense of the life of Marx himself, after Marx's death, you will get the revolution, or the development of science capitalism, the entrepreneurial version of capitalism. And by the later 19th century, this had given way to monopoly capitalism. It has given way to imperialism. So Lenin, this is why Lenin's important. So Lenin had to deal with that method by applying it to a new dimension in time. So he wrote about capitalism in its imperialist stage, the advancement of Marxism and the dialectics and the observation of how capitalism evolves into these things and what it destroys and takes. Lenin advanced the theory of Marxism into the theory of late-stage capitalism and imperialism. So those are the two variants operating. First, the ideology, and second, the methodology of it being applied to different societies at different times. Stick to the methodology for the time being. Having made the point for Lenin, I hope it becomes clear for the number of people. Mao Zedong, for instance, applied it to Chinese society, which was a different society from Russian society, understanding the inner dynamics of Chinese society related to the question of the peasantry in a different and more profound way than any previous writer, because that was the nature of Chinese society, and Mao had addressed himself to that. So like there were similarities to the Russian and Chinese revolution had way more peasantry than Russia did. So they had to adjust it according to that. And Mao was dealing with imperialism, being imperialized in his own country. And finally, for our purpose, the most important example, the example of Amilcar Cabral, because he was dealing with Africa. Cabral, in one of his most important essays, the one titled, quote, "The Weapon of Theory," end quote. Ooh, write that down. Amilcar Cabral. Let me read that again. And finally, for our purpose, the most important example, the example of Amilcar Cabral, because he was dealing with Africa. Cabral, in one of his most important essays, the one titled "The Weapon of Theory," if I recall correctly, began by making clear that the best he could do was a return to the basic methodology of Marx and Engels. But it was not possible for Cabral to begin the analysis of the history of Guinea-Bissau by saying, quote, "I am going to look for classes," end quote. For example, he said, quote, "If I say this, I will be denying that my people have any history because I do not perceive classes for a long period of in the genesis of my own people," end quote. He was referring back to Marx and Engels' classic statement that, quote, "The history of all existing societies is the history of class struggle," end quote, and to which Engels had appended a note saying that by, quote, "all history," end quote, we mean, quote, "all previous recorded history," end quote. It so happened that the history of the people of Guinea-Bissau hasn't been recorded, and Cabral says, quote, "I want to record that history. We will use the Marxian method. We will not be tied by concepts which arose historically in Western Europe when Marx had studied that society." So Amilcar Cabral right there is applying it to their society, to their culture, to their history, utilizing historical materialism. One of the methods that we use as Marxists is historical materialism. How things were and how we are now and what we need to do in the future. Marx uses the method and he describes the evolution of classes and of the phenomenon of classes itself as being a major determinant in Western European history at the particular point in time. Cabral says we will begin at the beginning. We will not even concern ourselves initially with classes. We will simply look at men in the process of production. We will look at modes of production in the history of Guinea, and we will see how our society evolved. So, without much of a fanfare, he was showing the relevance of the methodology of African society. If and when in the history of Guinea-Bissau, the aspects of class appears to have historical importance, when Cabral dealt with it, until such time he simply stuck to the basis of Marxian methodology, which was to look at Guinean people in the process of production, at the various modes of production, social formations, culture formations, which arose historically, and the direction in which the society was tending. In many aspects, when we ask the question today about the relevance of Marxism to black people, we have already reached the minority position, as it were. Many of those engaged in the debate present the debate as though Marxism is a European phenomenon, and black people responding to it must of necessity be alienated, because the alienation of race must enter into the discussion. They seem not to take into account that already the methodology and that ideology have been utilized, internalized, domesticated, and in large parts of the world that are not European. China would be one. China would be one. What's going on with Void? All right, no problems, Void. That is already in the ideology of 800 million Chinese. Listen to this. That is, during this time, that is already the ideology of 800 million Chinese people. That it is already the ideology which guided the Vietnamese people to successful struggles and to the defeat of imperialism. That is already the ideology which allows North Korea, the DPRK, to transform itself from a backward quasi-feudal, quasi-colonial terrain into an independent industrial power. That is already the ideology which has been adopted on the Latin American continent, and that serves as a basis for the development in the Republic of Cuba. That it is already the ideology that was used by Cabral, that was used by Samora, Mikhail, that which is in use on African continent itself to underline and underscore struggle and the construction of a new society. I cannot, Cook Noah, okay. I cannot therefore be termed a European phenomenon, and the onus will certainly be one of those who argue that this phenomenon, which has already universalized itself and is somehow inapplicable to some black people. The onus will be on those individuals, I suggest, to show some reasons, perhaps genetic, why the genes of black people reject this ideological position. We have investigated and tried to centralize or keep central the concept of relevance. We must ask ourselves questions about the present. What kind of society? What do we live in today? What kind of society do black people live in today in different parts of the world? And while, of course, we as black people in this country, in the Caribbean, and in different parts of Africa have our own independent historical experience. One of the central facts is that we are all, in one way or another, located within the capitalist system of production. The society about which Marx wrote through the process of outgrowth dominated Africa and the Americas in the era of mercantilism, which was a period that capitalism was growing to maturity. It dominated these parts of the world. It created slave societies in the Americas. Subsequent to the slave era, capitalism even more powerful as able to incorporate the whole world into a global network of production that derived from Western European and North America, a system which had a metropolitan center or a set of metropolitan centers and the separate set of peripheries, colonies, and semi-colonies. The peripheries would be the global south, and metropolitans would be the town centers. So that we have all historically been incorporated within the capitalist system and of production. And that is another dimension of the relevance of Marxism. Even without the transition in terms of time and place, it seems to me that if we have become part of the capitalist imperialist world, then we owe it to ourselves to relate to the following, to follow, to understand, and to hopefully adopt and adapt the critiques of that capitalist system, because that is essentially what Marx's writing is about. He was critiquing that capitalist system. He did so more effectively than any bourgeoisie writer. And if we want to understand the world in which we live, which is the world dominated by capitalism, then we must understand the centering of that system, the motor within that system, the type of exploitation that are to be found within the capitalist mode of production. So that is yet another factor. Marxism as revolutionary ideology. My second consideration, rather methodology, is to look at Marxism as a revolutionary ideology, as a class ideology in class societies. All ideologies are class ideologies. All ideologies derive from the support some particular class. So for all practical purposes, we have grown up in a capitalist society. A bourgeoisie ideology is dominated in our society. These institutions in which we function were created to serve the creation of ideas as commodities, ideas in which buttress the capitalist system. Now, I would suggest historically, as Marx suggests himself, that the set of ideas we call scientific socialism arose within capitalist society to speak to the interests of the producers in that society, to speak to the interests of those who are exploited and expropriated, to speak to the interests of the oppressed, of culturally alienated. And we must understand that the two major sets of ideas before us, idealism and materialism, bourgeoisie philosophy and Marxist philosophy, that each of the two is representative of a particular class. I don't have the time to go into all the historical roots of the formation of socialism, but briefly in the 19th century, it was in the rise of the capitalist society that conditions were created for the development of socialist ideas. Out of the diverse and unsystematized socialist ideas, Marx was able to formulate a clear systematic theory, scientific socialism. It had a particular class base, and because it had a particular class base, it was revolutionary. It sought to transform and upend the relations in society. Bourgeoisie ideology is a necessity, is of necessity status quo preserving. So it preserves the status quo to keep people satisfied. To seek to converse, I think that's right, conserve, to seek to buttress and give systems of production, the relation which flows from the certain system of production. Scientific socialist position is and remains revolutionary because it cautiously aims at determining that system of production and the political relations which flow from it. This is what I mean by revolutionary. For time and time, there are Marxists who have arisen, who have attempted to deny or denude Marxism of its revolutionary content. That is true. There are Marxists who have become legal and armchair Marxists who would like to see Marxism as merely another variant of philosophy and who treat it in a very eclectic fashion, as though one is free to draw from Marxism as one draws from Greek thought and its equivalent, without looking at the class base and without looking at whether an ideology is supportive of the status quo or not. Nevertheless, by and large, we can see Marxism and scientific socialism as a subversive and an antithetical to the maintenance of the system of production in which we live. Because ideas, let me repeat, do not float in the sky. They do not float in the atmosphere. They are related to concrete relations to production. Bourgeoisie ideas derive from bourgeoisie relations of production. They are intended to conserve and maintain those relations of production. Socialist ideas derive from the same production, but they derive from a different class interest, and their aim is to overthrow that system of production. This is good. I love it. I'm doing a reading in Micah, Africa and Scientific Socialism. There again, I will suggest that African people, like other developing world people, have virtually invested interest in scientific socialism because it offers itself to them as a weapon of theory. It offers itself to them as the tool at the level of ideas which will be utilized for dismantling the capitalist imperialist structures. This is its concern. What I will attempt to deal with as best I can are certain questions arising from individuals who might say yes to most of what I've said, and then will ask the question, quote, is there no other alternative? Is there no other ideological system which is neither capitalist nor socialist, but is anti-capitalist, but addresses itself more humanely, if you like, to the interests of the African people wherever they are? That's the question, end quote. These questions are worth looking into because they are black people asking these questions, and we have to try and resolve them. My own formulation will be to suggest that we look at concrete examples of Africa or black people who have attempted to devise system which they consider to be non-capitalist, non-socialist systems. They consider valid alternatives to scientific socialism for the emancipation of African people. In this regard, we have a number of Pan-Africanists, a number of African nationalists in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in this country, who have taken that road. George Padmore did this at the end of his life and made a distinction between scientific socialism and Pan-Africanism. He said this is the road we will follow, Pan-Africanism. We do not want to follow that road that is capitalist. We do not want to go down the socialist road. We will derive ourselves something that is Pan-African. And since Nkrumah followed up on this, and although at one time he called himself a Marxist, he always was careful to qualify this by saying that he was also a Protestant. He believed in Protestantism at the same time. So he was trying to straddle two worlds simultaneously. The world which says in the beginning was matter, and the world says in that beginning there was the word. The inevitability, he fell between these two. And inevitably, he fell between these two. It's impossible to straddle these two. But there he was. We must grant his honesty, and we must grant the honesty of many people who have attempted to do this impossible task, and follow them to find out why they failed. They failed because their conception of what was a variant different from bourgeoisie thought and different from socialist thought inevitably turned out to be merely another branch of bourgeoisie thought. And this was the problem, that bourgeoisie thought and indeed socialist thought, when we get down to it, can have a variety of developments on or roads and aspects or paths. With bourgeoisie thought, because of its whimsical nature and because of the way in which it promotes, eccentrics. Let me look up this word real quick, see what it means. Do 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 do. How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's doing fine. All right.
Eccentric.
Eccentric, a person or a person or their behavior, unconventionally or slightly strange. Okay. You can have any road because after all, when you are not going any place, you can choose any road. So it was possible for these individuals to make what I consider to be a genuine attempt to break with the dominance of bourgeoisie thought, and yet find in the final analysis that they had merely embraced another manifestation of that which they themselves had suggested they were confronting on the outset. There are a number of examples for more apt than others, some more apt than others. Some of the examples are Africans who I think were blatantly dishonest from the beginning. I do think that most of the ideologies of African socialism claim to find a third path are actually just cheap tricksters who are attempting to hoodwink the majority of the population. I don't think they're out to develop socialism. I don't think they're out to develop anything that addresses itself to the interests of African people. But nevertheless, it is a part of the necessity of our times that our people no longer are willing to accept anything that is not put to them in the guise of socialism. And therefore, I shan't, in fact, go on to African socialism. That what I'll do is take examples of those who were, in my opinion, being serious, being honest, and certainly Kwame Nkrumah was one of these. Nkrumah spent a number of years during the 50s and right up to when he was overthrown, that would cover at least 10 years, in which he was searching for an ideology. He started out with a mixture of Marxism and Protestantism. I'm going to look up this word just to make sure, because I don't know why. Hold on. I think it's the right word, but I want to just double check. Sounds like Protestant, but I'm pretty sure it is, but let me make sure. Protestantism. Yeah, okay, I'm right. Okay. Protestantism. He talked about Pan-Africanism. He went to Conchiism and then Nkrumahism. And there was everything other than a straight understanding of socialism. What were the actual consequences of this perception? What is the matter? That is what matters to us. Let us assume that he was searching for something African and that he was trying to avoid the trap of adopting something alien. What were the practical consequences of this attempt to disassociate himself from the international socialist tradition? We saw in Ghana that Nkrumah steadfastly refused to accept that there were classes, that there were class contradictions in Ghana, that these class contradictions were fundamental. For years, Nkrumah went along with his mishmash of philosophy, which took some socialist premises, but which he refused to pursue to their logical conclusions. That one either had a capitalist system based upon the private ownership of the means of production and the alienation of product of people's labor, and one had an alternative system which was completely different, and that there was no way of juxtapositioning the mixing these two created anything that was new and viable. So juxtaposition means alongside. Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Appa. A most significant test of these positions was when Nkrumah himself was overthrown. After he was overthrown, he lived in Ghana Conakry, Conakry. And before he died, he wrote a small text entitled Class Struggle in Africa. And that's in our Discord. It is not the greatest philosophy treatise, but it is historically important because it is there that Nkrumah himself is in effect amidst the consequences, the misleading consequences of the ideology which espoused an African cause, but which felt for reasons which he did not understand a historical necessity to separate itself from scientific socialism. It indicated quite clearly the disastrous consequences of that position, because Nkrumah denied the existence of class in Ghana until the petty bourgeoisie as a class overthrew him. And then in Guinea, he said it was a terrible mistake. Yes, there are classes in Africa. Yes, the petty bourgeoisie is a class with interests fundamentally opposed to workers and peasants in Africa. Yes, the class interest of the petty bourgeoisie is the same, or at least is tied in with the class interest of international monopoly capital. And therefore, we have in Africa a class struggle within the African continent and a struggle against imperialism. And if we are to aim at transcending these contradictions, at bringing victory and emancipation to the working peoples and the producers of Africa, we will have to grapple with that ideology, which first of all recognizes the challenges and challenges the existence and exploiting the oppressed classes. So even after that, Nkrumah understood that class struggle is what it is. That he lacked that analysis. All right, thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody. It is a very important historical document. It is the closest that Nkrumah comes to a self-critique. It is the record of a genuine nationalist, an African nationalist who wandered for years with this assumption and feeling that somehow he must disassociate himself in one way or another from scientific socialism because it originated outside of the boundaries of his own society. And he was afraid of its cultural implication. This is putting it in the most charitable way, but the fear is due, in fact, to aspects of bourgeoisie ideology, due to the fact that he made a distinction between social theory and scientific theory, which is not a necessary distinction. That is the distinction which comes out of the history of bourgeoisie thought. People seem to have no difficulty in deciding. I gotta make sure I keep the time because I love this book. Deciding that they are going to use facets of a material culture which originated in the West. Rather, it originated in capitalist or socialist society. People have no difficulty relating to the electricity, but they say Marx and Engels. That's European. Was Edison a racist? But they asked the question, was Marx a racist? They genuinely believe that they are making a fundamental distinction, whereas in fact, they are obscuring the totality of social development. And the natural sciences are not to be separated from the social sciences. Our interpretation of the social reality can similarly derive a certain historical law and hence scientific law of society that can be applied irrespectively to its origins or its originators. Of course, it is true that this is the most appropriated note on which to end. That an ideology, when applied, must be applied with sensitivity. It must be applied with a thorough grasp of the internal realities of a given society. So what he's saying is, like Lenin says, and what Marx most likely also says, you need a concrete analysis of the material conditions that you are part of in order to engage with certain implementations that serve and satisfy the material conditions of the masses. Marxism comes to the world as a historical fact, and it comes in a cultural nexus. If, for instance, Africans, or let us go back to Asia, to the Asian people, I'm going to say, when the Chinese first picked up the Marxist texts, they were European texts that came loaded with conceptions of historical development of Europe itself. So that method and factual data were obviously interwoven, and the conclusion were, in fact, in a specific historical and cultural settings. It was the task of the Chinese to deal with that and to adapt it and to scrutinize it and to see how it was applicable to their society. You have to develop it. Yep, damn straight. Thank you, Appa, for participating. I appreciate that. First and foremost, to be scientific, it meant having due regard for the specifics of Chinese historical and social development. So they had to understand the Chinese conditions, the history and social developments, because it does take into consideration the relations to production. I have already cited Cabral in another context, and he reappears in this context. The way in which he is at all times looking at the particularities of class development in contemporary Guinea-Bissau, looking at the potential of classes in Guinea-Bissau at this point in time. And therefore, he is, of course, making sure that Marxism does not simply appear as a summation of other people's history, but appears as a living force within one's history. And this is a difficult transformation. This is the task of anybody who considers himself or herself a Marxist. However, because of its fraught with so many difficulties and obstacles, many people take the easy route, which is to take it as a finished product rather than an ongoing social product which has to be adapted to their own society. One finds that in looking at Marxist theory and its relevance to race, looking at its relevance of Marxist theory to national emancipation, we come up with a very important paradox, that the nationalist, in the strict sense of the word, that is, the petty bourgeoisie nationalists who aim merely at recovering the national independency of our own epoch, is incapable of giving the people of Africa or the peoples of the Caribbean any participation in liberal democracy. The petty bourgeoisie cannot fulfill these historical tasks. Sorry, I'm getting excited. For national liberation requires socialist ideology. We cannot separate the two. Even the national liberation of Africa, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique very clearly demonstrates the necessity for an ideological development of conscientization. As they say in Latin America, and the nationalist struggle was won because it came under the rubric of scientific socialist perspectives. As Cabral said, quote, there may be revolution which have had a revolutionary theory and which have failed, but there has certainly been no revolution which has succeeded without a revolutionary theory. That's the end of that chapter. That was awesome. I don't know why, Joe, why are you coming up, Joe? Was it an accident? It was an accident. Chapter 4, Marxism as a developing world ideology. They use third, by the way, third. All right, we got some time. Let's see where my next stopping point is. Oh my God. Okay, cool, there's that one. So I'll see what time it is when I get to that one. And in case it's still more time, I'll see when I get, okay, good. This is an appropriate time at which to participate in a further discussion on the question of Marxism, because the amount of interest and the amount of practical attention which has been given to an ideology has increased enormously. In the process of this increase, there has also been inevitability and a tendency towards factionalism, a tendency towards wanting to adopt logically enough a position which the adherents of Marxism and scientific socialism considers to be the most theoretical and ultimately practical interpretation of what Marxism is. For my own part, I will, at the outset, for the sake of convenience, avoid entering into a discussion which will adjudicate between rival climates to the title of Marxism. It is not for me at this moment. I do not think it will advance our analysis in the time allocated if we were to launch into trying to determine who is actually Marxist-Leninist between the so-called Stalinists and the so-called Trotskyites, between one side or the other in the pseudo-Soviet dispute between the old left and the new left. That is to say, as a matter of convenience, I will avoid the complications inherent in those very often polemic distinctions. However, more than that, I believe that on a principle one can argue that there is a common understanding or a body of common theoretical understanding among all of those who are avowedly Marxist, and that there is an area which is smaller but nevertheless significant in common practice, common anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist practice among these rival groups. And this is part of my justification for avoiding the contentions. Besides, at a later point in the analysis, I will go on to suggest that one principle, the introduction of Marxist factionalism into developing world politics, political discussions in a priori fashion, is usually distinctive and at best is pointless. So let us attempt, however difficult that may appear to some people who are engaged in Marxist discussion, to take Marxism as though it were homogeneous, or as though we do not have to have a multitude of contenders for the title of Marxism, as it were the focus, and focus our attention on the developing world. The developing world at that part of the globe which has been engaged in capitalist relations for centuries, but which has been engaged in capitalist relations in its own peculiar way, quantitatively different from the way in which the metropolitan countries of the North America and Europe have been engaged in the capitalist system of relationship. And because of the qualitatively different manner in which the developing world has participated in the international capitalist economy, there are peculiar factors that are described as backwardness or underdevelopment or what have you. This is a portion of the world without capitalist, without significant insidious capitalist. Wait. Let me look this word up real quick. It's not insidious. It's I'm gonna look at it. Do. Sorry, I get nervous. That's why I do my do thing. I don't know why. OUS, perfect.
Indigenous.
Okay, indigenous. Okay, without significant indigenous capitalists, without the significant indigenous proletariat, very often having pre-capitalist social formations, still exist in various stages of disintegration. Our inquiry really amounts to trying to determine the relevance of Marxism to that part of the world, and more particularly understanding the relevance of a Marxist interpretation to strategies designed to transform or speed up the transformation of these parts of the world, which are very often lightly termed the developing world. They say the number 3. So in trying to answer the question, quote, how is Marxism relevant to the developing world? End quote. My instance is that we understand that Africa, Asia, and Latin America, when referred to as a developing world, do not constitute a social economic system which is distinct from the capitalist centers of the world. If we make that distinction, I believe we will fall into all kinds of traps when we attempt to apply the analysis of Marxism or any other kind of ideology to the developing world. We must see the countries of Africa, most of Asia outside of China, Korea, Vietnam, and virtually all of Latin America outside of Cuba as still functioning as integral parts of the capitalist world. It is merely that they complement the capitalist centers. And this, after all, is not the thesis that need necessarily be exemplified to great lengths today in 1975, because a large number of non-Marxian scholars have also come to accept this complementarity as this dialectical relations between that is often called the centers and the periphery, or the metropolitan heartlands and the colonial or semi-colonial or neo-colonial areas of the world. Looking at this question over several decades, we find the different answers having predominated at different times. The earliest answers suggested by the colonial powers themselves were quite simple. They said to developing world peoples, Marxist-Leninism or scientific socialism or communism was absolutely no relevance to your needs and interest. Indeed, this ideology would be completely, I don't know how to say this word either. Hold on, everybody. Watch me say it, and then I know what it is. Sometimes when there's two different letters together, the letters kind of like screw me over. It's like, how do you do that one? C-A. All right, there it is.
Inimical.
Inimical, tending or obstructing or harm. Inimical. So so it says it would be completely inimical or to your needs or interest. The colonial powers, their spokesmen and ideologies simply said, in effect, that Marxism was not good for the natives, that this was not a vision of the world which should be incorporated into a way in which colonial people saw themselves, saw their societies, and saw the world outside. And this was consistent with the position of power. Colonialism sought to ensure that colonized peoples should not wage effective nationalist struggles. They were opposed in the earlier years, even to the expression of nationalism. So it follows that they were all the more bitter, all the more concerned to oppose that brand of nationalism which was enlivened in Marxist thought, which went beyond saying that we are determined to have independence, but that we are also determined to build a new society which is completely different from the capitalist society we have inherited. And it is generally true that while colonialists were hostile towards Marxists inside of their own countries, they were doubly hostile to Marxism and to Marxists who might appear in India, in parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Quite obviously, it has not been an easy history for Marxist thought inside the Western countries, in Britain, France, and North America. Up until today, Western Marxists are discriminated against in institutions such as these. But the bourgeoisie metropolitan system has certain capacity to accommodate. It sometimes, in fact, goes out of its way to incorporate some individuals who are outside of the so-called mainstream. And it will, therefore, give the task within the limits of its own maintenance. And it will allow some Marxist thought to exist. But the developing world practice for many years, and I think it still remains true, it is resolutely opposed on the part of the same powers, the development of Marxist thought. It seems to me, then, that the bourgeoisie themselves recognize their vulnerability in the developing world. They recognize that Marxist thought was a double potency, if you like, in the developing world countries. This attempt on the part of the imperialists and the colonial powers to keep Marxism out of the developing world understanding was not entirely successful. There have always been instances of African, Asian, Latin American, and Caribbean Marxists operating in their own societies, operating at international level, sometimes quite successfully. But by and large, we must accept that throughout the colonial period, extending right through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Marxism has a significant ideology lacking both in individuals to articulate Marxist ideas in journals and political parties to represent the Marxist-Leninist position. Hello. The colonialists were relatively successful in maintaining the exclusion of Marxist thought. More importantly, they created a generation of developing world scholars who were immersed in bourgeoisie theory and who peddled all of the understandings which they gained from bourgeoisie theory. And this usually meant, for instance, that they were automatically anti-Marxist without even thinking about it. They were anti-Marxist. They had an idealist vision of the world, and they assumed that they had was a universalistic vision. So basically, it's the development of the comprador class he's talking about how the comprador classes take up the guise of the bourgeoisie thought because the bourgeoisie, the monopoly capitalist bourgeoisie, gives them their status quo and their power, even though they're just ministrations for the capitalist bourgeoisie. Hi, Rufus, you look cute. They saw the capitalist system and they thought that the capitalist system is, and always will be. See, and that's the other thing that capitalists create. They say it's the end of history, which is a bunch of shit. They saw the human beings functioning within the constraints of the capitalist societies, and they said, quote, "There's a man." And they began to talk about human nature and the like. And they did not and cannot perceive that they are speaking about human nature only in a particular social system. Thank you, gifters. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. All of these understandings were entrusted in the developing world visions of itself. And that applies irrespective of whether we were trained in these institutions abroad or rather we were trained in the surrogate institutions such as the universities of the West Indies or the University of Ghana or Makerere, Makerere, because one can be bought into line with the bourgeoisie worldview, either by being brought to the metropoles itself, or alternatively, the bourgeoisie institutions can be transferred to the metropoles to do the job locally as a sort of forerunner of a international branch plant economy of the multinational corporations. Again,
Assalamualaikum.
Pompadour classes. The Pompadour classes. What did Benny say? Went to work, didn't want to. I'm sorry, Benny. However, that was an era that I think is disappearing. It is not past. One has to see the trends. One has to see that today it is not a simple argument between bourgeoisie ideology and Marxist ideology. The simple dichotomy between good and bad, the forces of evil and the forces of Christianity, and so on. The kind of argument is no longer very acceptable. A number of factors have intervened. For one thing, when it used to be told to the Guyanans and or to the Jamaican that communism is evil and Marxist-Leninism has no value. It was part of the package in which the bourgeoisie asserted that Marxist-Leninism cannot work. You see, quite apart from the moral, philosophical, and ideological agreements, there was this appeal to the so-called practical, and it said, quote, it said, even if we grant the theoretical validity of this system, we can prove it to you that it is not efficient, that it does not work, that capitalism is efficient, and that socialism does not give people food, that there is starvation in Russia and no clothes, and that the Chinese are eating grass. See, those were years ago in the early period of the development of the revolutionary system in the world. And that's the shit we deal with now. The disruptors, the ones that don't know shit, drive us to have to always romanticize the past histories, the past revolutions, instead of dealing with the current conditions of things inside our current conditions. I swear to God, every time we try to have a conversation with non-communists, that's always the format to do those things. Here, I'll repeat it. Grant the theoretical validity of the system. We can prove to you, this is what they do, that it is not efficient, that it does not work, that capitalism is efficient, and that socialism doesn't give people food, that there is starvation in Russia, no clothes, and that the Chinese are eating grass. We always have some form of that in our conversations with people that are not communists. You see, those were years ago I can go on. But as the Russian Revolution passes those initial years of extreme economic difficulties, the difficulties which they had inherited from Tsarist regimes, and as the Chinese Revolution grew from strength to strength, transcending the period of absolute impoverishment of the masses that was characteristic of feudalism and imperialism in China, it was and is no longer possible to seriously propose to any developing world country that socialism does not work, that it is not a practical system, as it were. So the argument must shift. It must in some way come to terms with ideological dimensions. I believe the argument which has shifted, and I would like to focus on that shift because it is the contemporary dimensions of the discussion of Marxism in the developing world. This new discussion, the new shift, means that in the first place, Marxism is not posed directly against bourgeoisie ideology. There is an attempt to avoid this direct confrontation. Marxism in the developing world, I've seen this in Africa, it's happening in the Caribbean, it happened in Asia, is counterposed against some other visions or visions of the world. Africans or West Indians will be told, quote, we understand that Marxism has some validity, but we do not think that Marxism is relevant for us. We have to look for our own solutions, end quote. which is one of the more important ways of countering the Marxist worldview. And as you can see, it is obviously has a greater initial plausibility than the old distinction between Marxism and bourgeois ideology, between socialism and capitalism. The second variant on the same theme that is often interconnected is that one can be told that there is some strength in Marxism and in socialism on the one hand, and there is some strength in capitalism and capitalist theory on the other hand, and that one of our tasks is to borrow intelligently from the two systems. So here again, you find that Marxism is not positive as something that one runs away from absolutely as an ogre that is painted in certain colors that are very frightening. It is approached rather obliquely, and one is told to choose some elements from either of the two systems. I believe that these are both sleights of hand and are ideological divisive, intended to weaken the development of scientific understanding of the world. And I shall try to indicate where I feel the logical weakness lies in both approaches. And we'll end there. And we'll start tomorrow on the peculiar views of the developing world. We get this today. This shit happens today. Oh, hi. I'm sorry, Gray. The rise of Marxism in the developing world and in the class struggle of the developing world. The burdens of the developing world Marxists. And then chapter 5 will be laboring as a conceptual framework of Pan-African studies. I love Walter Rodney. Such a communist that I say is like not a lot of people read from, I would say. Not a lot of people read from. I don't see people bringing up Walter Rodney besides when they mention like how Europe underdeveloped Africa, which will be next after this book. But God, I can keep reading this book and reading this book and reading this book and reading this book. I can read this book all day. I can read this book all day. But yeah, like
فرحني بهدية عمو please فرحني بهدية.
And we ended on page 58. Internet, page 58.
Please هدية يا عمو فرحني بهدية please.
Please give Miriam coins if you can. Do you have able to do that? Yeah, I would suggest that other people read ahead and then come back, and when we read, like it should bring you more understanding, and you can help me out. You can help me out, you know what I mean? And understanding it better. So I encourage people to read ahead and come back, and let's have discussions. Let's have critiques. Let's have things where we can actually discuss and talk about these things and how they're supposed to be significant and stuff like that. But I love that how he went over the fact that Marxism is a study, that as a science that exists in time and space. Anyways, Doodley, I'm going to address Joe first and then Doodley next. What's up, Joe?
I was coming up for the page number, but I see Lynn got it at the last minute. So other than that, I just came up to participate possibly in the conversation.
All right. What's up, Doodley?
I just came up to say that this is a good book and I love the way that you read.
Why? How am I reading?
Because you actually genuinely enjoy it rather than seeing it as you go, dang it, I can't read now?
You mean the time is up?
But I want to read more.
This book with Ho Chi Minh, I used to call myself, because Ho Chi Minh is a hoe for communism, Uncle Ho. And then when I started reading Walter Rodney shit and reading that book, that textbook that you're thinking about reading, it really drove the point that Marxism is a methodology that is revolutionary and can be applied in different. And I love how he said that, like, to determine the relevance of a Marxism theory is to have the debate, have the questions, and see if it can be stretched and if we can bring it to fruition within the conditions. And Walter Rodney's proving that yes, you can. Yes, you can. You know what I mean? So I love it. I love it. It is an actual science. Scientific socialism is the science. So yes, I love this book. This book will be my ever glorious book that brought me to Marxism. So does anybody else have anything? Hey, Sean, anybody else have anything to say about this book? This book is fantastic. Anybody have any critiques that they want to bring up?
I do not. I enjoyed so much everything that you've read.
Okay. What about you, Dooley? Any critiques, any good things, any things that really hit you?
No critiques. If I were to say anything good about the book, I'd just be reading the book at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good book.
It's a very good book. And you know what? And it should draw our attentions, and it should deconstruct our whiteness towards like applying Marxism in the developing world or the global South, right? So like it should deconstruct that and deconstruct the fact that the methodology of Marxism is not only applicable to Eurocentrism. It can expand and develop into beyond Eurocentrism, if that makes sense. If I'm making any sense.
Yeah, I get that.
Any pushback?
That you're saying, I get what you're saying. Yes.
Okay. All right. Decolonial. I can't say it. Decoloniality / decolonial Marxism / Afro Marxism. Yes. Based. Yes. Deconstruct your Eurocentrism. You know what I mean? The expansion. I like it when he brought up Nkurum. When he brought up that type of example of how that, like, I understand we're not class reductionists because Walter Rodney does bring in the racial disparities, the culture that needs to be addressed through a Marxist analysis and the class analysis, and that Nkurum failed on the class analysis, and that gave wind to him being overthrown, right? And to bringing by the petty bourgeoisie because he had a poor class analysis of those things. Because again, there's that book that he mentioned in here, Class Struggle in Africa, I forgot what it's called, by Kwame Nkrumah, is in our library. So that indicates that he not only came to the understanding, but took the critique and criticism to advance his development in communism, which I'm glad that Walter Rodney brought that attention to that, because Nkrumah is great. You know what I mean? Because he has a book called Neocolonialism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism. I can't remember what it is. So, all right. Does anybody else have anything? Yeah, Nkrumah in Ghana.
Nkrumah.
Yeah, Nkrumah.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dooley. Do you have any last thing before we close out?
Much love. Take care.
All right. All right, everybody. Tomorrow, same time, around 6:30. This book is wonderful. Next book will be How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and Grounding with My Brothers, one of his older ones. And it has more on the Jamaican side of things. So it's going to be great. Get free. Yes, break your chain.
Which we should.
Go ahead.
Which we should definitely be reading right now, considering what just happened to Jamaica.
Yeah.
We should definitely study and learn more about them.
Also, learn about this methodology and see if you can apply it in your life and how you engage dialectically with other people and with things. You know what I mean? All right, cool. All right, everybody. They're going live now. So I'll talk to you all.